The book. Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. 4th Another Day. Chapter 2. The Girl in the Alley. Day of wrath, oh day of mourning. See fulfilled the prophet's warning. Heaven and earth in ashes burning. Oh, what fear man's bosom rendeth, when from heaven the judge descendeth, on whose sentence all dependeth. Come tomorrow, I'll save you. But could you keep your voice down just for tonight? If you call for help now, I'll kill myself. Because I tried to kill you, you see. If the police catch me, my life's over. They'll prove I sold off defective houses and then start arresting the terrible people I did business with one after another. If that happens, my life may as well be over. The moment you call for help, I'll choose death. But before I kill myself, I'll make sure to kill that precious family of yours. I'll get revenge on you, the one that forced me into suicide, and then I'll drive my car into the sea. So please, think carefully about it. If they hear your voice, someone will come running. That person will hear about what happened from you and rescue you. I wonder how much time that will take. I wouldn't think any more than 20 minutes. Maybe an hour tops. Either way, I do believe I'll have time to leave this building and drive my car to the house where your parents live. I do know where the house you grew up in is. I think I'll hit your sleeping parents on the head 3 times each with a hammer. A nice 3 times you'd do it. But if you don't want that to happen, you should just keep quiet all night tonight. Above the pitch-black walls, there was a beam of light from a flashlight that felt like a searchlight. A guard was pointing down on her. The walls were wet with rain, and the light hitting them made them shine white. Her eyes had adjusted to the darkness, so that bright light felt like a sharp needle to her eyes. She squinted and tried to look up at the face on the roof, but without even having to confirm it with her eyes, she knew that voice belonged to Ugami Teruhiko. The sound of thunder echoed in the distance, and the narrow view of the night sky she had between the 2 buildings would light up every now and then. She felt like she was at the bottom of a deep valley, rather than between 2 buildings.
Please, get me out of here.
You never used to say such selfish things. I can't right now. I'll get you out tomorrow. First, give me some time to make a getaway. Tomorrow night I'll have already escaped overseas, so I'll call the police from there and have them come rescue you. But until I've gotten far away, I'd like you to be quiet.
Up until this morning, she believed she wanted to spend the rest of her life with this person. He was always kind and never raised his voice. He had been the kind of person who, shortly after a fight, would make a disheartened face and admit he was wrong. But now it looked like that was all a facade.
I came back to check if you were still alive. It looks like I'll be getting through this without having to commit murder. That's a relief.
Was the betrayal she was feeling right now real? Was this some elaborate joke he'd constructed? Was it a dream? But those hidden tens of millions of yen she had found really did seem to be real bills. She'd taken the bag with the money in it with her when she'd left his room. She couldn't remember right away what she'd done with it. She'd had it hanging from her hand when she called him on the payphone, and when she climbed up the stairs to the roof, though.
I bought you something to eat. I assume you're hungry.
He threw something down to her. It crossed the beam of the flashlight and fell onto the muddy ground. It was a box of donuts from a store he liked and went to eat at often.
You can eat those. You've got to make sure to eat properly or you'll ruin your skin.
She felt humiliated by the fact she hadn't seen through him to discover who he really was up until this point. I'm not eating these, she declared to Ugami. She wasn't going to be fooled by him anymore. What would put Ugami at ease right now more than anything else? That would, of course, be her death. You didn't come back here to keep me alive. You came back to make sure I was dead, didn't you? These donuts have something harmful in them, don't they? I don't know what that might be, but I know you could at least get your hands on something like that. You've had some dangerous people as business partners, haven't you? It wasn't going to end like this, she thought. She had to get out of here and hand this man over to the police. I won't beg for my life no matter what, and don't forget this. You need to keep me alive, because if I die, you'll never get that thing you had hidden in your ceiling back. There was a long silence. During that time, the sky lit up twice, and a low, frightening sound echoed. Did you hate the job you have that much? If you're going to change jobs, you should go for something besides burglary. A weary voice came from above. As she expected, he hadn't noticed that the money had been taken from his room. You had quite a bit saved up. What was it, around 50 million? If I hadn't spent so much time looking for a place to hide it, I could have made our meeting time earlier. So if these donuts have poison in them and I die, then you won't get that money back. Not ever.
A little time went by, and then words flew down onto her head. Fine then. Stop those donuts to the ground. I'll go get some other food to throw down to you. It was a voice like an omnipotent god telling a divine revelation to a human. The storm clouds cleared, and a narrow strip of sky between the buildings became brighter, little by little. The sounds of salarymen in traffic jams going to work, and of running cars spewing out exhaust, just managed to reach Akari. For Morioh, it was a normal morning, just like countless others. But for Akari, it was her first morning waking up stuck between the two buildings. In the rain, her makeup and the mud had washed off her, but her discomfort did not abate. Undoubtedly, society was still going on out there. People were surely entering the two buildings next to her, punching their time cards and starting their work for the day. The place she was stuck at was the busiest block in the whole town. At night, people stopped passing by, but of course people wouldn't disappear during weekday afternoons. If she yelled out for help, someone would surely notice, but she was hesitant to do so. Ugami's words that he would hurt her parents lay heavily on her heart. He'd said if she stayed quiet for one night, he'd call for a rescue after he escaped overseas. But that deal was off. He wouldn't kill her or leave Morioh until he got his money back, Akari thought. Her wristwatch had broken from the impact. She didn't know exactly what time it was, but it should have been around the time Ugami Teruhiko would be coming to work. On the other side of one of the walls she was surrounded by was the company she'd worked at. Directly on the other side of the wall was an office. He was probably drawing out plans and getting coffee for the female employees around now. There was a lot of noise outside. He was probably keeping watch out in case there was an ambulance coming to try to rescue her. If there was a big disturbance, he might go hurt her parents. She didn't want her parents to get hurt. In order to avoid that, she needed to find a way she could get out without him noticing. But was there even a way to do that? The space between the vertical walls was about 1 metre in width and about 15 metres in length. There were no windows on either wall. All she saw were ventilation fans here and there. There were pretty much flat walls going all the way up to the roof, and there was no chance of anyone poking their head out a window and noticing Akari was there. She felt like she'd become a millimetre-long ant stuck between two encyclopedias on a bookshelf. She couldn't climb up the intertwining pipes on the side of the alley facing the street to escape either. When she climbed about 2 metres up, there were no longer any pipes she could grab onto with her fingers. Above that space, there were only pipes that went straight up to the roof that looked like a grate. No matter which angle she stared through the gaps in the pipes, she couldn't see the street. There were outdoor parts of air conditioners jutting out lengthwise that were stacked one on top of one another, and parts of the wall that stuck out, completely obscuring her view. Her voice would definitely reach the outside, but it didn't seem like she'd be able to move her body out. The situation wouldn't last long. Probably around the evening he'd surely reconsider his thinking and let her out. It was summer, so she didn't have the threat of freezing to death, but her body had grown cold due to it being wet from the rain. Even after morning came, not much light shone between the buildings, which left her just crouching there in the cold mud. At noon, the light of the sun finally shone through the narrow gap between the two roofs. The gloomy gap filled with radiance, lighting up Akari's mud-covered arms. Warmth spread across her skin. She'd never known how kind the sunlight was. She thought about her mom and dad. She wanted to live in the city more. She couldn't stand the idea of taking over the farm. Back before Morioh started developing, her mother and father openly allowed her to choose that way of life. When she was quick to pick a city university, they cheered her on then too. And when she couldn't find a job and came back to Morioh, they took her back in without saying a word. She'd done nothing but been a burden to them. She didn't want to bother them anymore. The sun only slipped in through the gap between the buildings for 15 minutes. The light was obscured by the edge of the roof, turning it back into the dark, dreary space it was before. She decided that when she got out of here, she'd go see her parents. Night fell, and there were signs of people who had finished work for the day going home. On the side of the alleyway facing the street, she heard the sounds of tired evening footsteps.
They'd spent their whole day without imagining for a second that there could be a woman trapped between the two buildings. It grew dark around her, and the signs of nearby humans went away. From above, an armful of bags from Kamayu Market, as well as a box of donuts, rained down on her. Good job going all day without calling for help. If I were in your place, I'm sure I would have made noise right away. I really would never have believed those threats about harming my parents either. You really are a model daughter, aren't you? The light of the flashlight shone down on her. Ogami was peering over the protective fence, and she saw his face just beyond the edge of the building. He was far away, so she couldn't tell what kind of expression he had. She beat the side of the company building wall with her hands as hard as she could. She felt a sharp pain in the bones of her fingers from the despair-inducing hardness of it. For a tiny thing like you, breaking or climbing up this wall's impossible, huh? To get your soul out today, you need a certain keyword. That's a type of location, the name of a place. As soon as those words pass your lips, that giant wall will disappear from your life. They're the magic words that grant you your freedom. I'd say them soon if I were you. One sentence. All you need to do is say it. I need that money to live happily into my old age, you see. I need to show my grandchildren magic tricks and teach them how to draw. Understand?
If you do anything to my family, I'll bite my tongue and die, and the location of the money will die with me.
She couldn't just tell him something like that. If he got that money, the next thing he'd be thinking of is how to keep anyone who knew about it quiet. She could be sure of that. If anything were to happen to your family, you wouldn't know anything about it being down in that hole. Sure is a problem, isn't it? Both of us are unable to act in order to protect the things important to us.
Is money seriously that important to you?
Your life depends on that attachment you're making fun of. If I just up and decided I didn't care about money, you'd die. You really can't afford to let this troublesome situation continue very long, you see? Now then, until you speak those magic words, I'll have to keep charge over you to make sure you don't die. It's really quite annoying, but I bought you food as well as some other things. Medicine, for example. You were in the rain all day yesterday, right? You gotta be careful not to make your cold worse. Inside the vinyl bag, she saw cold medicine, poultices, vitamin pills and hygiene products. There was also bottled water. She was lucky the bottles didn't break after being dropped from up on the roof. The muddy ground and trash had worked as a cushion for them. When she was looking at what was inside the bag, she sensed Ugami's gaze on her and felt sick to her stomach with disgust. Then Ugami spoke in a voice like he was scolding a child for being mischievous. That thing you took is something I obtained through putting myself in real danger. It may just be a bunch of yen to you, but to me it's like a medal. It's proof that I existed. I've thought about how I want to use that money to buy my grandchildren a slide or a swing. It's true that if you said where it was, you'd lose the trump card that's been your weapon in negotiating. So, since yesterday, I've been trying to come up with a deal that will guarantee your safety. I'll come back tomorrow with some more food. I'll also get a blanket and some tools to keep you out of the rain. Maybe even some crossword puzzles to kill time with too. The light from Ugami's flashlight disappeared as he moved away, plunging the area around in darkness. She groped around the bags to find the bottled water from the supermarket. Her hand shook, not out of fear but out of indignation instead. The idea that these things he'd thrown down to her were tied to her survival infuriated her to no end. When the water washed down her throat, she smelled something odd. For one moment, she wondered if the water might be really old, and then a pain pierced through her throat that felt like she'd swallowed a flame. She tried to vomit it back up, but it was too late. It wasn't just her throat. Her tongue and the inside of her mouth also burned. She tried to scream, but she couldn't. She was unable to breathe or even cough. She fell to the ground and struggled, grabbing hold of the muddy ground and shoving it into her mouth. The cool sensation of the mud lessened the burning heat. She saw a figure on the roof. It seemed that man hadn't left. He just turned off the flashlight and was actually observing from above the whole time. Her vision was blurred with tears, and before long, the inside of her head went dark. On a morning news show, they were talking about the subject of illegal construction. In other prefectures, several apartment buildings were found to be below the national standard for earthquake proofing. There are also problems cropping up in which, without having so much as filed for a confirmation application for making an area on the first floor into a parking area, there were cases where apartment buildings that were turned into stores after they were completed, cases where prefab huts had been built on roofs at some point, and cases where the total lettable floor space in office buildings was larger than it had been when the application had been filed. In all these cases, the inspection agency had given them a pass grade after construction had completed. And after that, it seems that things such as extensions being added on and remodelling being done had happened without first getting permission. There were countless cases of such illegal activity all across Japan. It seemed that some money had been secretly changing hands behind closed doors, and Morioh was no exception. With Morioh's sudden, rapid development, there were lots of recently built and brand new houses, and there were bound to be many illegal activities like this littered all over that just hadn't come to light yet. He watched the TV out of the corner of his eye as he got ready. The image on the screen changed completely, and bright music came on as a weather forecast started. It was Friday, January 7th, 2000. Morioh was going to have a clear day starting right in the morning. It was the first day of his third semester. When he was putting on his school uniform, the many remaining scars on his arms caught his eye. The remains of scratching them with his fingernails and scars from cutting himself with scissors still remained on his body. There were remnants of his unstable boyhood days. The long-sleeved school uniform was perfect for covering them, and Budagaka High School allowed students to wear long sleeves even in the summer. Thanks to that, he was able to keep his arms hidden all year long. He'd written a fake medical record in the hospital, allowing him to not have to attend classes like phys ed, where it's required to change clothes. He never took his coat off at school. The only ones who knew about the scars on his arms were his old friends and the staff at the orphanage. Before he left his house, he stared at a postcard that he stuck to his wall with pushpins. There was a photo of a grass-covered plain and two horses standing there huddled together printed on it. They were small in the centre of the picture, so you couldn't make out their facial features, but both horses were coloured black. As he stared at the photo, the horses looked like Jet for a moment. Jet was a name an ancient people had used in reference to a certain mineral. He thought maybe he would make his ability's name into this. Using the name of that mineral as a part of his ability's name seemed like a good idea. Even though it had been many years since he'd become able to see it, he still hadn't given the dark brown leather-bound book a name. On his way to school, he stopped at a convenience store in front of the train station. He opened up newspapers, flipped through manga magazines and left. As long as he had 1 minute to spare, he could memorize all the pages, so he didn't need to buy anything. He hadn't actually read them, but if they entered his field of vision, a description of them would remain in the leather-bound book. When he had time later, he'd read back through that text, and every nook and cranny of those pages would reappear correctly in his head. Every day he'd stand around reading without buying anything, which made the store employees hate him. When he got to school, everyone in the classroom was talking about how they had spent their winter breaks. Every bit of noise that emitted from his classmates was sucked into his mind. He didn't hear each individual voice, but he recorded the noise like he constantly had a tape recorder running. He had to be careful to communicate with his classmates. It would look conspicuous to not have a single friend, so he got on speaking terms with several people, while at the same time keeping a good feeling of distance between them. He couldn't be alone in the classroom, but he couldn't get too into a conversation either. He limited his conversations to entertainers, stories he'd seen on TV, and complaining about teachers. As far as people he currently hung out with outside the classroom went, there was only Futaba Chiho. One reason he wasn't as distant with her was because he thought that he could more soundly keep up appearances if he had one good female friend. There were other reasons too, but if he said them to her, he was sure she'd get mad, so he kept them hidden. On the first day of the third semester, after the opening ceremony, there were just 90 minutes of class. The class was on history and geography, but as soon as they started, the teacher began to pass out papers for a pop quiz. His classmates let out sounds that were kind of like shrieks. He made the same kind of face that they did so he wouldn't stand out. 5 minutes into the test, he called out his leather-bound book. When he imagined a book in his head, it would appear, floating up from his palm like a submarine surfacing. It wasn't a book made with normal paper or printing techniques. It had almost unlimited pages. He flipped through the pages, searching for the answers to the test questions. What he had seen when he had flipped through history textbooks was also there in text form. While he was gathering the solutions from his past, the teacher noticed, thinking his behaviour was a bit odd. Apparently, he thought Takuma might be cheating, but the teacher couldn't see Takuma's book, so he figured it must have been his imagination and simply passed by. While he was getting ready to go home, he had a conversation with 3 other classmates. During the conversation, the title of a manga he'd never heard of came up. He called out the leather-bound book, searched for the words, and judged that it was a particular gag manga he'd seen serialized in a manga magazine 3 years earlier. What he'd seen when he was flipping through that magazine was written in the leather-bound book, so as he was talking with his classmates, in his mind he extracted that event and read the manga that had been recorded in the corner of his field of vision. Moments of his past he had in his memories could be rewound and replayed in slow-mo in his head like a videotape. The event of reading the magazine had gone by in a moment when it had actually happened, but now he could carefully go through it 1 page at a time. Even the drawings of the manga became visible to him through the text. It was similar to the way a TV could turn a simple electric signal into a video and music. As he was reading through the descriptive text, the panel layout of the manga reconstructed itself in his head. He then started talking about his impressions of the manga he'd just finished reading to his classmate. Their memories were vague, but Takuma knew so much detail he was able to quote specific lines from it. He continued this not too excited, moderate conversation for a few minutes. It was an incredibly boring few minutes. The words he exchanged with his classmates simply made his eardrums vibrate and immediately disappeared. A description of them would remain recorded in the leather-bound book, but they wouldn't weigh at all in his mind. Even the smiles on his classmates' faces just gently glanced across the front of his eyeballs and scattered away. The scene of the classroom that should definitely have been in front of his eyes became so unreal, it made him want to doubt it was actually there at all. Someday he'd get away from here and escape to some other place, he thought. He'd get on a train or a bus and leave this town, looking for a place like one on that postcard where grassy plains stretched to the horizons. He headed towards the front entrance to leave for home, and 3 boys standing around talking next to the umbrella stand caught his eye. The noon sun slipped through the entrance to the school, pouring light onto their school uniforms. Of the 3 boys, 2 were tall and 1 was a bit shorter than average. Previously, he'd snuck into the staff room at night and glanced over a huge amount of documents. The documents had photos of the faces of every student in the school, as well as their address data written on them. That experience had been compressed into text form and stored in the leather-bound book. But he knew those 3 boys' names without even opening his book. The short boy was a student named Hirose Koichi. He was the one who first discovered Orikasa Hanai's body and reported it to the police. When Takuma searched for his face and name in the leather-bound book, he learned that Koichi was someone he'd passed by in town and at school many times. Takuma had even passed behind him as he stood around reading magazines in the convenience store and stood right next to him when they were waiting for crossing signals. But Takuma didn't think Koichi would remember him. The people Koichi was talking to were Higashikata Josuke and Nijimura Okuyasu, both of whom were delinquents. Hirose Koichi seemed like the kind of normal student that wouldn't hang out with delinquents, but apparently he went around with these 2 a lot, and with Josuke in particular. He was quite famous. There was no one in the school who didn't know who he was because of his hairstyle. Some thought his pompadour looked like a spaceship, while others thought it looked like a bullet train, while still others thought it looked like a battleship. It was bizarre seeing someone with a normal appearance like Koichi next to Josuke and his weirdo hairstyle. Takuma was interested in what Koichi was thinking now, seeing as he was the first one to discover the corpse. So he pretended to tie his shoelace and attempted to watch their lips from a distance. Their lips just needed to be in the corner of his vision. He'd practiced so he could tell what they were saying just by reading the movements of their lips and, using his ability to replay every exact detail of visual information he'd taken in, he'd become quite good at it. He stood around 10 metres away from them, put his bag down in a corner of the hallway and started to retie his shoes, thoroughly taking his time. A large group of students passed between them, so he didn't hear the words Koichi was saying. All that entered his ears were the voices of the crowd of people passing by, and the sounds of their footsteps at the front entrance. Red marks on his arms. Koichi's lips formed those sounds. Takuma wondered for a second if he'd seen wrong, but Koichi continued to talk to Josuke and Okuyasu with a serious expression. The killer might be in the school. A pack of girls walked cheerfully out of the school building. While crouching there in quite a light-heighted scene, he made a troubled face. Koichi and the other 2 boys started walking. They didn't go outside, but rather left the umbrella stand they were standing next to and headed towards the first-year classrooms. They were on course to pass by Takuma, crouching in the corner of the hallway in 30 seconds. He held his breath and tied his shoe as he waited for them to pass by. It was definitive. Hirose, Koichi and the others were undoubtedly talking about the Orikasa Hanai incident. Currently, the public account was that Orikasa had not been killed. They were just handling it as a mysterious death. But they'd used the word killer, as in they had positive proof that someone had killed her, and they even knew about the scars on his arms. Suddenly, someone shoved Takuma from behind. He stumbled and put his hand on the wall to balance himself. His fountain pen dropped out of his pocket and rolled onto the ground. It was a pen given to him by a friend he called Crybaby Boy when he had started living on his own. Crybaby Boy had been taken in by relatives from Kyushu and was probably living a happy life now.
"Oh, just got there standing by. I'll kill you, you goddamn idiot!"
It seemed the passerby had not been looking where he was going and knocked into him. A second-year boy looked down at Takuma. He'd shaved eyebrows, baggy pants, and the kind of dangerous-looking upturned eyes that made Takuma think he might be high on drugs.
"Sorry."
Takuma lowered his head and the student spit out a brown loogie, which landed on top of Takuma's shoes. The student snorted with laughter and walked away. Takuma reached out his hand to pick up the fallen fountain pen. It was a smooth black pen decorated with golden rings. It was the type you could get anywhere. Just before his fingers were going to wrap around it, the sound of the fountain pen being stepped on and broken echoed around the area.
"Whoops! Sorry!"
Takuma looked up and saw Nijimura Okuyasu in front of him. He was the one who'd stepped on the pen. Next to him were Koichi and Josuke. They looked back with a "what happened" kind of expression on their faces. Okuyasu lifted his foot. The fountain pen had broken in two, right down the middle. The ink inside was leaking out through the crack and had seeped between the broken pen fragments.
"Sorry, man! Wasn't on purpose!"
said Okuyasu with an apologetic look on his face. He had a strong build, a short haircut, and was making an unrefined expression. He was a delinquent who gave the impression of being a stupid comedic sidekick, and he was actually stupid in real life too. There were rumours he couldn't even add two-digit numbers together. Seeing him up close like this with that look on his face, Takuma thought those rumours were probably true.
"Well, I was thinking about throwing it out soon anyhow."
Takuma gathered up the broken fragments, opened a handkerchief in his hand, and put the broken pieces on top of it. The thick blue colour of the ink on the fragments was staining into the handkerchief. Koichi and Josuke gathered around, leaving Takuma now surrounded by 3 people. He seriously wanted to click his tongue at them. "Can I see it for a sec?" Josuke peered into the palm of Takuma's hand. His duckbill-like bangs hit him in the face and almost poked him in the eyes. He'd finely chiselled features for someone Japanese. He was popular with girls too. They always gave him enthusiastic greetings when he was walking home. Rumour had it his father was a Westerner. "Yeah, it should turn out okay, actually. This is one of those types that fix themselves if you wait a little bit." He had a friendly expression that reminded Takuma of a puppy. "Fix itself." Josuke seemed to ignore this statement, and then, for an instant, there was a blur. And it looked like Josuke had 2 arms laid on top of each other. It was like an image on a broken TV. But in the blink of an eye, his vision went back to normal, and he was sure he had imagined it. "Here, have a look. This must be made out of that shaped memory alloy stuff. It's seriously awesome." Josuke looked into Takuma's hand with a surprised expression on his face. Up until a moment ago, there were fragments of a broken fountain pen in his hand. But now those pieces had joined together and returned to their original rod shape. There wasn't even any sign of a crack on the whole thing. Had the pen being broken been an optical illusion? But he was sure he'd picked up the broken fragments. And even after the pen was fixed, the stain on the handkerchief from the ink that had leaked out still remained. It was an impossible phenomenon, but there it was in the palm of his hand. "Let's get going, Okuyasu." Josuke said that to his friend and started to walk away. Okuyasu walked next to him and the 2 left. "You must be glad. It's back to normal," Koichi said before turning to catch up with the other 2. The sounds of the students' chatter echoed through the hallway. Their voices dissolved into the voice of a teacher scolding someone, the sound of girls laughing and other noise. They then disappeared into a crowd of uniforms. Outside of being restored to its original state, the fountain pen had no changes to it whatsoever. He wiped it with his ink-stained handkerchief and put it in his chest pocket. Suddenly, the brown spittle that was stuck to his shoe entered his vision, which he wiped with the handkerchief as well. He'd originally planned to leave the school immediately, but he decided to change his course of action and head for the 3rd floor of the school. In a hall of second-year classrooms, he found the male student who'd spit on his shoes a few minutes earlier. He headed for a stairway landing where there didn't seem to be any people nearby. It was a place where the delinquents would always go to smoke in secret. The stairwell was completely quiet. You couldn't hear a single noise. When he got to the landing, the delinquent realized he was being followed. He turned around and furrowed his thinly shaved eyebrows. "Who the hell's there?" he screamed. He immediately covered his face with his bag and examined the area. There wasn't anyone around but the two of them. When his voice disappeared, a calm presence returned to the corner of the school. His field of vision of the moment when Josuke had come close to him, and when he'd looked down at the broken pieces of the fountain pen, had been recorded. He hadn't imagined Josuke's arm doubling. From out of his arm, covered by his uniform, rose another arm, like his soul had split off from him. It was very similar to what had happened when the leather-bound book appeared out of Takuma's palm. The new arm moved at an incredible speed. Clenching its hands into a fist, it touched the contents of Takuma's hand for just an instant. Or so it seemed, anyhow. After that one moment, the arm returned to overlap with Josuke's arm and disappeared. The whole thing happened at a speed so fast that one couldn't normally follow it with the naked eye. It took him quite a few rereads of the book's description of it before he could finally understand what had happened. He didn't know the true identity of Higashikata, Josuke's 3rd arm, or whatever it was, but he thought that it was probably the cause of his pen being repaired. The moment the fragments went back to normal had not been in his field of vision, so unfortunately that was not recorded in the book. With clever hand movements like those of a skilled magician, Josuke's palm had blocked Takuma's view. In the moment when his palm had passed over the fragments, the fountain pen had returned to normal. He was sure of one thing about that arm. It was just like his leather-bound book, in that it was a mysterious power that could be called out at any time and couldn't be seen by normal humans. It was the first time he'd met someone other than himself that had one of these bizarre abilities. And perhaps it was not only Josuke, but also Koichi and even Okuyasu who were endowed with these abilities. Maybe that was how they'd gotten hold of those pieces of information regarding the Orikasa Hanai case and why they were exchanging it. He stepped into a group of first-year girls at the front entrance of the school. There were more than 10 girls gathering in the hallway, each getting ready to go home. They were emanating a very fun atmosphere, and it sounded like they were planning to all sing karaoke after this. He spotted Futaba Chiho's face among them. He frequently passed by or saw Chiho inside the school. She was always surrounded by lots of friends, and it was rare to see her walking the hallways alone. She swung her bag around sluggishly as she laughed with friends, and they were scolded by a teacher for being too loud. As he passed by the pack of girls, Chiho looked towards him. She raised a hand to greet him, but Takuma pretended not to notice and passed right by. It wasn't the time for that right now. When he exited the building, the cold January wind chilled his body through his school uniform. He had a high tolerance for heat and cold, so he didn't mind it. As he walked towards the school gate, he felt the presence of a person approaching him from behind. When the heels of the person's shoes hit the pavement, he could tell by the sound that arose from it that it was her.
"Were you staying after school? You're usually not still hanging around this late."
Chiho had caught up with him and now was walking next to him. She had her usual white scarf made out of a simple fabric wrapped around her neck and mouth. Her bag was hanging in her hands, which were covered by thick gloves.
"Well, what are you doing here so late? It's way past the time you could have gone home."
"I got caught up in conversation with some friends in the classroom. Stuff about the red and white singing contest they held on New Year's Eve, and about wanting to copy each other's homework we did over winter break."
"That sounds tiring."
"No, I'm feeling really refreshed."
"You sure are forthright."
She frequently turned around. Maybe she was concerned about her friends, seeing that she'd left the school.
"So, what are you doing, Senpai?"
"Cleaning. There was trash around."
As they left through the school gate, they heard the siren of an ambulance that had stopped at the entrance to the school. Chiho turned around and mumbled something.
"I wonder if something happened."
"I'll bet they found somebody wounded and collapsed." Probably at that stairway landing the delinquents always sneak off to smoke at.
He wouldn't be leaving the hospital anytime soon, and that guy would definitely not be explaining what had been done to him or by whom. That was because he didn't see his attacker's face, and honestly didn't know what method the person had used to wound him in the first place. During class, I thought about that white cat, the female cat named Trinita that Hanai had been keeping. After we checked her memories in Rohan's studio, I stealthily returned her to the police station. My older teacher, who was wearing heavy clothes, turned to me and said, "Keep your eyes up, Fred." He was writing English sentences on the blackboard with white chalk. It was an elective course, so there were students from several different classes there. They had sleepy looks on their faces and were flipping through pages of their textbooks. Seeing those gestures reminded me of Rohan looking through Trinita's memories. Heaven's Door. That was the name he'd given his stand. The sentences that were written in the pages of Trinita's body were the memories of what the cat herself had witnessed. Heaven's Door converts the abstract concept of memories into a series of written characters. The cat didn't know actual words like ball of yarn or school uniform. It was probably because Rohan knew them that those words appeared on the cat's body. On that line of logic, if Rohan fought in Italian, would the cat's memories be in Italian too? Words and memories seem to be linked by some ambiguous bond, don't they? Like if the symbols representing meow enter one's vision, the image of a cat would appear in their mind. If the symbols for boyoyoin, it makes them imagine something soft and springy. Truly, the symbols of written characters awaken memories in us. The teacher had a classmate read English sentences from the textbook. I was relieved he hadn't called on me. The weather outside seemed cold as usual, and the whole sky was covered with grey clouds. The students out on the school grounds of Phys Ed sure looked cold, but the classroom was nice and warm. My teacher, who had been wearing heavy clothes, had put his jacket on his desk at some point. He wiped sweat from his brow and adjusted the controls on the heater near the window. It looked like he was going to turn the heat down. This reminded me of a certain experiment. A person who had been hypnotized had been made to believe the statement, "You are having a lit end of a cigarette pressed onto the back of your hand." Of course, this wasn't actually happening in real life, but the subject broke out in a sweat and started to act like he was hot. A blister even formed on the back of his hand, meaning the thing he had believed in his mind had had physical effects on his body. When a shaman writes text on a note and hangs it somewhere as a charm, he's probably aiming for a similar effect. He makes people see the symbols of written characters. The brain then draws out an image that corresponds with that text, which psychologically, or perhaps physically, brings about some effect. Using that, a shaman could do things like curse or heal people. While the teacher repeatedly adjusted the heater, sweat dripped down from his tilted head. Even after turning the heater completely off, the temperature in the room didn't go down whatsoever, which he appeared to find strange. My classmates seemed hot too. Some people started fanning themselves with their desk mats as the temperature in the classroom continued to rise. It was scorching, like on a summer afternoon or like asphalt in the sun, causing a heat haze. Scorching! If that word appears as a sound effect written in a panel of a manga, it would make the image of summer heat appear in the reader's head. Those characters would make them imagine the heat of the sun. Finally, a male student stood up and placed his hand on a window. It seemed like he was going to try to bring in the cold air from outside. But when he tried to undo the lock, he let out a scream. "What the hell is this?" All the locks on the windows had hair tangled in them. Countless long black hairs. The boy tried to free his hands from the hair, but it was though the hair was holding some kind of grudge and he couldn't untangle himself from it. Of course, some hair floating in the air had not become entangled by coincidence. I turned my head to look at a female student named Yamagishi Yukako. Yukako-san was ignoring the commotion our classmates were making and was staring at her textbook. She was a beautiful girl that gave off an image of some kind of carnivorous beast, like a lion. She had a very intense personality, so everyone was afraid of her. She brushed back the long hair she prided herself in and sat there without changing the expression on her face. Even though it was a classroom in the dead of winter with a heater off, the temperature continued to scorchingly rise until it became the kind of heat you'd feel in August. Everyone knew how inexplicable this was, but left with no alternative, they started taking off their jackets and sitting down. People wearing long-sleeved shirts rolled them up their arms. People who were wearing sweatshirts underneath took them off so they were only wearing t-shirts. One by one, they ended up with short or rolled-up sleeves, exposing their arms. Seeing this, my mind was finally met with relief, because as I looked at all my friends, I didn't see any sort of red scratch marks. Echoes! That's the name of my stand. Just by willing it, my tailed stand would appear behind my back. It looked like a lizard, but occasionally it'd walk around on two legs in the form of a small human. He floated around the inside of the classroom, but my classmates and teacher didn't notice him at all. That's because of the rule that the only ones who can see stands are stand users. I sent an order to Echoes. The tailed stand landed on the ground and peeled the scorching characters off the floor. He rolled the characters into a ball and kneaded them like clay. Once he'd shaped them properly, he stuck them onto the end of his tail. Immediately coinciding with the disappearance of the letters, the classroom regained the coldness of winters, and my classmates put their jackets back on with baffled look on their faces. Thanks for your help back there, I said to Yukako-san at her desk after class was over. With an embarrassed look on her face, she said, It's no problem. I'm really happy to be of any help to you, Koichi-kun. At that moment, a male student who was trying to run out into the hallway knocked into me with his shoulder and almost made me fall over. The boy muttered a quick sorry and hurried on forward. But after a few steps, he suddenly tripped and fell to the ground on his hands and knees. I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't been looking closely, but there was hair tangled around his ankle. It had coiled around it in a way that looked like it was constricting him, and he breathed heavily like he was in pain. Yukako-san turned to look at him with an expression like she was looking at an insect and let out a loud from her nose. Yukako-san! When I called out her name, the hair coiled around the boy's ankle fell apart like it had lost its strength and fell on the ground. Then, without any sort of timidness in her voice, Yukako said this. That's right. If I'm going to kill him, it would be better to do it in a place where no one's around. Tuesday, January 11th, 2000. Josuke Okuyasu and I were searching the school for someone with red scars on their arms. The boy we thought had killed Orikasa would be wearing a school uniform, so he thought he must be someone in middle or high school. There was a possibility he was taking classes in that very building, so we were checking male students' arms using our own personal methods. Come lunch break, we still hadn't found any boys that seemed like they could be the culprit, though we didn't think we'd be able to locate the boy with the scars in just one day. It was likely to be a task that would take several. But if that boy had a stand ability like we did, we were sure to encounter him eventually. That's because there's a saying that stand users are drawn to other stand users, like two planets being drawn together by their gravitational pulls. Even if we didn't want it to happen, before long we would be sure to run into him. However, we found the boy with the scars before that day was even over. The entrance to the bookstore was made of glass, so you could see the faces of everyone passing by outside, even if you were inside the building. Chiho stood around near the entrance reading a magazine and occasionally glanced outside. Students on their way home from school braced themselves against the cold as they walked towards the train station. The sky had been cloudy since morning, and it looked like the day would end without the sun ever peeking through. She checked the time on her phone. It was about time Hasumi-senpai would be coming. As soon as Senpai's lessons were over, he wouldn't linger around the classroom for a second. He'd always leave the school like he was running away, so it was easier to predict when and where he'd be passing by. There was something she wanted to ask him about her novel. It had been 2 years since she had decided she'd try to write it. Over those years, she would wonder several times a day just what is a novel. It was a pretty crazy feeling for an author to have when you felt about it. Normally, they just passionately get down to weaving a story together, right? But what even is a story in the first place? Since she had entered high school, she'd made a lot of friends. The majority were girls, but she talked with boys in her class to a moderate degree. They all ate at the school cafeteria and go to peep in on clubs. But she had no one to talk openly about writing novels with. When people asked what her hobbies were, when she said reading, things were fine. But when she said writing, she thought it made the situation feel awkward. The only people she talked about writing her own novel with were her family, her friend, and Hasumi-senpai. When it came to finding people to ask opinions about novels, she felt Senpai was qualified. Through the window pane she saw the side of her face she recognized. Looking closely, it was a somewhat gloomy face. She closed the magazine and put it back on the shelf. She walked out of the bookstore and, while bracing herself against the freezing cold, she hurried ahead of a few people and walked up to the back of someone clad in a black school uniform who was walking on their own. Even among a huge crowd, she could spot Hasumi-senpai's back. He had no muscle whatsoever beyond what you could describe as skinny or slender. It was at the point where he gave the impression of being meagre. Even when she walked next to him and gave a quick greeting, Senpai didn't even grin. He just glanced in her direction to acknowledge that he saw her. He was pretty much always like this. When she asked him what he thought the things we called novels were, he spoke in a voice colder than permafrost.
If that's the sort of thing you're worrying about, then you're probably better off not writing one.
Well, I just thought that knowing you, Senpai, you'd have some interesting thoughts on the subject.
What would give you that idea?
Because you have so many books stored in your head. She wasn't sure if it was because of that or not, but he had the smell of old books hanging about him. It was so distinct she could close her eyes next to him and imagine it wasn't a human there, but a tall stack of book pages.
What I remember are the tens of thousands of actual books, the order of the words on all their pages. Purely the books, not the novels.
Well, I guess books and novels might be different.
They're as dramatically different as the body and the mind.
Hasumi-senpai's memory thing was apparently like the data from scanning the pages of books. He had a huge amount of image data in his head, and he was able to take that out at any time and look at it. He did nothing more than hold it. As for the meaning of the data, he couldn't know that without passing it in front of his eyes like anyone else would. She highly preferred books made of paper, so she wasn't sure whether or not she would enjoy reading books using memories like that, but it did at least seem like a good way to kill time on long train rides.
But if there were an ultimate novel in all of human history,
Hasumi-senpai said,
you might be able to kill people with it.
Before long, they could see the dome roof of Morioh Station. It was a train station with Western-style architecture that was rebuilt when the town was redeveloped. The bus stop was in a roundabout in front of the train station. They constructed a circular pond in the plaza at the centre. Everyone that came to Morioh knew that in that pond there were some turtles that had made their residence there. They crossed the street from the bus stop and were passing around the side of the lake when it happened. They heard a voice calling from behind them, and both of them stopped simultaneously. Excuse me a sec. You got a wristwatch? Would you mind telling me the time? I kinda need to figure out how long it is till the bus gets here. They turned around and there was a tall male student standing there. Even among the first years he really stood out, so they knew both his face and his name. He was a tall figure with refined facial features. What stood out most of all was that devastating hairstyle. If you happened to get one glimpse of it, you couldn't forget it for days, and it would even show up in your dreams, she'd heard. Could I just see that wristwatch for a sec? Josuke looked at Hasumi-senpai's wrist. Chiho was nervous. Ever since that dangerous situation she'd met with in elementary school, she hadn't been very good with people that looked kind of delinquentish. Higashikata Josuke wore a baggy school uniform and his backpack was squashed flat, so if this wasn't a delinquent, she didn't know who was. Oh, you do have a wristwatch. Chiho nudged Senpai with her elbow. There was a silver wristwatch around his wrist.
All right.
As always, Senpai nodded without as much as a grin. He extended a thin arm to Higashikata Josuke. She thought he was going to show him his wristwatch, but she was wrong. He pointed straight towards the train station.
There's a clock on the train station. Why don't you go look at that?
He said it in a particularly curt manner. Senpai! Her face went pale. Senpai and the delinquent stared at each other's faces. The clock over there? Josuke turned back towards the train station with what looked like a troubled expression on his face. It was at that moment when Chiho first noticed it. The clock on the train station building was broken. The long hand was heavily bent and the short hand had disappeared somewhere. There was a round hole on the face of the clock, like a rock or something had collided with it. That's weird. I'm sure it was working perfectly when I saw it this morning. It seemed Hasumi-senpai had only just noticed it then as well. I don't know, man. Maybe somebody broke it. But anyway, now I can't tell what time it is just looking at that. Josuke sat down on the edge of the pond. The edge of the circular pond in the middle of the roundabout was made of concrete. Josuke casually picked up a paper clip that had fallen onto the ground. It was a clip that looked like it was made from one long, slender piece of metal. He bent it with both hands, stretched into a very long pole, and started playing with it. It came off to Chiho as very odd. Senpai, come on! Your wristwatch! Had Senpai not heard the terrible rumours about Josuke? When her friends talked about Josuke, it always sounded like he was an extremely dangerous guy. Apparently, even the third-year delinquents never went near him, despite him only being in first year. Making an oh well sort of face, Hasumi-senpai looked at his wristwatch. He looked like he was going to say what time it was, but before he could announce the time out loud, Higashikata Josuke came up to Senpai, brought his face incredibly close to him and peered down at the watch, as well as the wrist it was on. Cool! Thanks, Senpai.
No problem. I do owe you for my fountain pen.
Without betraying any emotion, Asumi-senpai pointed a cold gaze at him. Higashikata Josuke looked at Senpai's face, looked down at the top of the fountain pen poking from his pocket, and a smile stretched across his face. It was an expression like he'd suddenly remembered something. It seemed that somehow this wasn't the first time the two had met.
What sort of sleight of hand trick did you use back then?
I told you, man, I just put the raw materials back to how they were.
Ah, well, whatever.
Hasumi-senpai tried to pull in his arm, and Josuke grabbed it in a panic. Hold on a sec. My eyes were kind of blurry. I didn't get a good look. The wristwatch was hidden by his jacket sleeve. While Josuke was grabbing Hasumi-senpai's wrist with one hand, he used his other to try to roll up his sleeve. It was unmistakably an action with the goal of getting a good look at the wristwatch, but something about it seemed very purposeful and unnatural. With his sleeve pulled up, Senpai's pale skin was visible. Sensei never took his jacket off, so Chiho had never seen his skin past his wrists. But before the wristwatch could become visible, Senpai grabbed Josuke's hand and forced it back.
Don't just go grabbing other people's uniforms.
He shook Josuke's arm off. Chiho wanted to say, don't be so rough, but she couldn't get her voice out. She thought she might make Josuke angry. And when she looked over at his face, timidly, not only was he not mad, he looked bewildered and had a shaken look on his face. But I just wanted to look at the watch.
I have no proof you washed your hands the last time you went to the bathroom. Now do I?
Josuke had a hurt expression on his face. I washed them. You gotta believe me, man. I swear to God. He put an intense look on his face, and maybe because of his hairstyle or his posture, he gave an aloof impression, different from that of a normal person. But looking at him from right next to him, the expression kept changing constantly, making it actually kinda hilarious. The exact opposite of the always unsociable Hasumi-senpai, she thought.
Well, fine. Right now the time is 20 to 5. I hope the bus gets here soon.
As Senpai read the time on his watch aloud, he looked back at Chiho.
Shall we get going?
At that moment there was a clink sound. It was the sound of Senpai's rich watch buckle coming undone on its own. It slipped down from his wrist, and, leaving a streak of silver in its path, fell straight down. There was a circular pond right next to them. After the watch collided with the concrete rim around it, it made a sound like a rock being tossed in as it fell into the pond. The water's surface quivered from the impact, and little floating pieces of ice hit each other. The turtle that lived in it was nowhere to be seen. It was probably hibernating for the winter. The wristwatch sunk to the bottom of the pond, and some small bubbles rose from it. It was so cold it was hard to believe the pond wasn't frozen. If it were frozen over like it was yesterday or the day before, the watch wouldn't have sunk. Chiho couldn't help but think that some demon that brought misfortune onto people must have broken the ice earlier. Man, that really sucks. Josuke peered into the pond. But I think you're okay. All the watches they make these days are totally waterproof. And even if it is broken, I'll fix it up for you. I got a knack for fixing broken gadgets and stuff. It was hard to tell if Hasumi-senpai was listening to what he was saying. He was bent at the waist, picking up something small that had fallen to the ground. What Senpai picked up was the paperclip Josuke had been holding a moment earlier. But while Josuke had been playing with it and bent it into a long rod, it was now back to its original paperclip shape.
You said your name was Higashikata Josuke, right?
Hasumi-senpai stared squarely at him.
I've heard of you because you're quite famous. Is this another one of your sleight of hand tricks? You used your power to turn things back to normal to undo the clasp on the wristwatch, didn't you? Like, maybe you stuck that paperclip you made into a straight rod in a gap in the clasp or something, right?
I don't know what the heck you're talking about. I'm pretty sure that ain't the paperclip I had a minute ago. Anyhow, maybe you should hurry up and get the wristwatch out from the bottom of the pond. I'd like to get it for you, but there's a turtle in this pond, you see. Though he'll be in hibernation right now, I'm still kind of too scared to stick my hand in that water. Josuke looked down at the pond with an apologetic look on his face. Just for an instant, he glanced sideways to Senpai. His gaze gave the impression that he was trying to observe something. It was odd that Hasumi-senpai wouldn't show him his wristwatch, but this Josuke person, despite being a fellow high school student the same age as them, also seemed quite odd. Go ahead, senpai, pick it up. Your hand's only going to be cold for a second. Hasumi-senpai only stared down silently towards the bottom of the pond, not making any indication he was going to pick the wasp up. At this point, Josuke made a face like he'd understood something and spoke. Ah, yeah. Just so you know, you might really want to pull your sleeve up so it doesn't get wet. Hasumi looked back at him with a glare, though Senpai's eyes were narrower than the average person's, so it always looked like he was glaring whenever he looked at someone.
You're a pretty funny guy, aren't you?
The air suddenly grew tense. The mood was turning into a dangerous one. I thought you were pretty weird. Maybe I've actually got the right guy. Senpai, mind if I ask your name? Higashikata Josuke's polite demeanor had disappeared. Chiho shrunk back from the sound of his deep voice. Senpai showed no sign of agitation.
What point would there be in introducing ourselves? It's just one person asking for the time, and the other person telling them. Or do you go around the town asking the name of everybody you get the time from?
Couldn't you just show me your arm? If you don't give me permission, I honestly don't have a problem checking it by force.
Why, pray tell, do you want to see my arm?
Quit playing dumb already. How the hell many people you think I've asked so far? You seem pretty dead set against rolling up your sleeves, and that's because there's something you don't want people to see on the skin of your arms. Since you're hiding them, I'm sure you figured out what it is we're looking for, right?
I haven't the slightest idea what you're talking about. But you really are a funny guy.
For the first time that day, sunlight crept through the clouds, shining a light on a wide area in front of the station. Chiho squinted from the brightness. The sun sinking in the west was dyeing Morioh a shade of red. All Chiho could do was gulp and stand there silently. Before long, Senpai opened his mouth.
Chiho, you asked me questions about novels before, didn't you?
He said, glaring at Josuke.
I suppose that a novel's something made up of many lines of characters. The characters are symbols which, when strung together, form words. When words are strung together, they form sentences. And then when sentences are linked together, they become a novel. Much like how DNA is made up of base sequences, characters are arranged into a sequence. That's what I consider a novel.
After he said that, Senpai stuck his hand into the water without rolling his sleeve up. Once he grabbed the watch and pulled it up, Senpai's school uniform sleeve was thoroughly soaked and a large volume of water dripped from it.
I expect that the job of an author is a lot like weaving a thread to create a carpet. The shape woven with the thread, that's the long sequence of characters, is not a simple visual image, but a certain type of value, or an emotion that cannot be put into words.
Josuke looked down at Senpai's soaked sleeve. So you're admitting it? When he said this in a voice full of conviction, the sound of footsteps drew near. A tall male student was running towards them from the station building. It was a student by the name of Nijimura Okuyasu who was always hanging around with Josuke. He was also a delinquent that was famous around the school. Josuke had looks that the girls seemed to like, but Okuyasu was a person that gave you this terrible feeling from looking at him, like looking at a mad dog. And not just a mad dog, a Tosa breed of dog. "Josuke!" Nijimura Okuyasu yelled. With his attention still focused on Senpai, Higashikata Josuke called out to him. "Okuyasu! I found him!" She wasn't sure of the details, but it sounded like Josuke was informing him that he'd found Senpai. The two delinquents, Josuke and Okuyasu, set their gazes on Hasumi-senpai. But Senpai didn't pay the situation any mind. He turned towards Chiho like the two of them didn't even exist.
Have you ever felt it? The power of a story. A long string of characters can undulate, arrest your heart and carry it to a far-off place. When you read a novel with real power, it makes you feel like the characters in the story truly exist. The pain and joy of the characters start to feel like your own. Your heart sympathizes with them. Sometimes when the characters in the story suffer an injury or are betrayed by a friend, you, the reader, also feel a largely physical pain. That is empathy. Similar to the Taoist shaman's writing on a charm that jinxes his target's body, an author kills a person with empathy.
While Senpai was performing his monologue, he took a handkerchief out from inside his pocket and started to wipe the wristwatch that had fallen into the water. He was calm and composed, as if to say all problems had been solved, and all that was left was to go home.
"I haven't actually checked his arms yet, but I'm sure this is the guy," said Josuke.
Okuyasu scratched his head like a bewildered wolf.
"Yeah, he's probably got him on his arms too. But you know, he's the fifth guy. We already found 4 guys inside the school. We peeked into the sports club locker room. There were a few of them. They all had the exact same shaped red lines on their arms. They all matched down to the number of the lines. So I think there might still be a bunch more guys like that in the school. I mean, we already found 4 after not a whole lot of searching."
"They've all got red scratch marks on their arms?" Okuyasu nodded.
Hey, I checked out this conversation a while ago. Can we go home now?
They didn't reply to Hasumi at all. Okuyasu poked Josuke in the arm. It looked like a signal for them to go back to school. Josuke clicked his tongue, and after turning back to Senpai for one last moment, started running off towards the school with Okuyasu. Chiho was left alone with Senpai next to the pond, still clueless as to what had just transpired, breathed a sigh of relief. What had saved them was undoubtedly the fact that they were good people in their everyday lives. Kind of like how someone over the age of 30 might say, faith can make a sardine sacred.
"Senpai, do you know that guy, Josuke-san? He really is something when you see him up close. I mean, it was like he had Italy sitting on top of his head."
Don't say that in front of him. He'll think you're making fun of his hair.
With water still dripping down from his sleeves, he tapped the face of his watch with his fingertips and murmured,
It's broken.
No matter how long they stood there, it wasn't going to help anything, so they started walking again. They passed through a shopping district and talked about the events that had just occurred. Josuke had said he was going to get on the bus, so why did he go back to the school? Why did he suddenly glare at Senpai and get so belligerent? The questions had no end.
Don't worry about it. There's probably just something wrong with his head.
"Weren't you acting a bit strange too, Senpai?"
Senpai did not respond. 9 months had now passed since they'd met at the Fawn building. At the end of the 3rd semester, it would be exactly 1 year. Even after so much time had passed, there was still so much she didn't know about Senpai. But in the exchange that had just happened, there was one thing Senpai had said that she was bothered by.
I have no proof you washed your hands the last time you went to the bathroom, do I?
Those were the words Senpai had said to Josuke when he had tried to touch Senpai's arm. And she was sure the boy that had saved her back when she was in elementary school had said something similar.
That girl. Take your dirty hands off her. I'll bet you don't even wash them after you pee, do you?
Though it might be a little hasty to link the two together just because they use the same sort of expression. Right? She thought about it a bit, and she decided that maybe any boy might use a phrase like that.
By the way, Are they still investigating that mysterious death?
Hasumi asked as they stopped by the bakery in the shopping district. The evening sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, and it started to get dark around them. A great many people in coats came and went. It was quite busy with the congestion and music around the shop. Chiho shook her head.
There are tons of bizarre rumours beside that one, though, aren't they? Like that rumour about the rock that moans, or that road that's not on any map.
Those sound more interesting than a mysterious death. This town really has a lot of bizarre places, doesn't it?
They bought their usual donuts at the bakery. Their toric shape was philosophical. It was the exact opposite of Josuke's hairstyle and a very feminine shape, she thought as she bit into it. On their way, they reached a three-forked road where Chiho split up with Senpai and returned to her home. She sat down on her living room sofa and her family poured her some warm coffee.
Orikasa Hanai.
She thought about the newspaper article with that name printed in it. She still kept a clipping of the article in her house. She continued to pretend to not know anything. As long as he didn't say anything, she decided to keep silent herself. But Chiho had caught on to several facts, including the fact that he was fixated on the incident. He normally pretended he didn't care about it, but whenever her name was mentioned, it was clear he was flustered. But she wouldn't say it out loud. She wanted to preserve their current relationship. She made a mark on the concrete wall with a sharp rock. This was the 7th time. 7 days had gone by since she'd fallen from the roof. The outside world should be entering the month of August now. The temperature in Morioh was going up, and the space Akari was stuck in was sweltering. The moisture in the mud below her was evaporating, making her feel gross from the humidity. There was trash scattered all over that had been thrown down from the roof just as she'd been. There were only things like scraps of cardboard and the broken frames of umbrellas. A banner from a supermarket was caught in the pipes as well, perhaps blown down to where she was by the wind. She tried putting all those things together to make a tent, but she couldn't fit her entire body in it. It was only big enough to stick her head under it while she was lying down. Still, compared to having nothing between her and the sky above her, it was a much more comfortable position to sleep in. She couldn't bathe, but there was bottled water among the things Ugami had thrown down to her, so she was able to use that to wash her face. Next to the jungle of tangled pipes, there was a storm drain which she used as a toilet. There was a metal lattice she couldn't have even fit her hand in without taking it off. Looking down it, she could see about 2 meters of darkness. It seemed to be connected to a sewer, as there was water running at the bottom. When she got her face up close to it, it smelled awful. She couldn't really use it for anything besides relieving herself and throwing away garbage. She killed time by listening hard to the sounds of the hustle and bustle of far-off people. She couldn't help but feel a bout of joy whenever she would hear the occasional fragment of a conversation. Around noon, when Akari was examining the condition of her throat, she heard the sound of a cat nearby. Rubbing against the wall of the bank building, there stood a cat. It was wearing a red collar and had light brown fur. It had a confused look on its face, as if it were wondering, what's a human doing here? But it immediately turned around and went off into the narrow space between the multi-tenant building and the bank. This was a space of just 15 centimetres, a space so tight that for a human, it might as well have been completely closed. But for a cat, it was one of innumerable passageways. She tried to yell wait, but couldn't. Her tongue wasn't moving normally, and with her throat but horribly burned from the drug, all she managed to get out was a wheezing sound. She pressed her face against the space the cat had disappeared through and stretched her hand in, but she could only reach up to her shoulder. An alley far narrower than the one Akari was in stretched on and on. Down it was the side of another building. She saw the cats behind turn into a narrow corner between the buildings, before it went out of sight. Night fell, and the usual plastic shopping bag was thrown down to her. In addition to food items like bottled water, rice balls and candy, it also contained a felt-tip pen and a notepad. It was too dark to see, but by sense of touch she could tell that's what they were. The thing that makes humans human is language. I'm giving that to you. Even if you won't say the magic words, you should at least be able to write them down in a notepad. Relax. In around 2 weeks, you should at least become able to moan. Ugami's voice came down from the roof. His shadow was visible in the opening between the buildings with the moon shining behind him. He wasn't lit up by a flashlight anymore, probably because if he had the light shining on him on the roof in the middle of the night, it would be more likely for someone to see him. She didn't know what sort of trick he was using to get into the building every night, but she suspected he was giving a substantial sum of money to the guards. When she drank the water with the drugs in it, she thought she was going to die. But that water wasn't meant to kill. He merely gave it to her to ruin her throat. It seemed that when the drug dissolved, it would react with the digestive enzymes in her saliva and generate heat, but then her stomach acid would neutralize it, making it harmless. I had the drug adjusted so it wouldn't kill you, but there was still a possibility it would dissolve all your organs, so consider yourself lucky. And of course, the fact that you're still alive is a great blessing for me as well. Even if he hadn't taken her voice from her, she had no intention of screaming. Though he probably wouldn't have believed that. He couldn't have thought the threat of harming her parents would keep working forever. I've said it many times now, but there's only one thing little old you needs to do. Get out of the gap between these giant walls. I know it may be hard to write while it's so dark, but once you write those magic words in that notepad, leave it somewhere where I can see it. I'll let down a fishing line and a hook to retrieve it. He still hadn't realized where the bag with the 50 million was. That reminds me. I have news that I think you'll be happy to hear. Your parents visited the company. They were worried because they weren't able to get in contact with their daughter. I partook in conversation with them. Since you and I are supposed to be friends, I encouraged them. Your daughter's surely just off on a trip. I'm sure she'll be back soon, and there's no need to worry, I said to them. I gave them emotional support. Your very own mother grasped my hands tightly and thanked me. She said thank you again and again with tears rolling down her face. I wanted to tell them your daughter's actually right next to this company, actually. She's on her hands and knees, covered in mud like a dying stray dog. Though your mother's hands were fat, cracked, and rather cudgel-like. Honestly, I shivered when those hands grabbed mine. I suppose that's the result of working in fields. She'd thought about introducing her mother and father to him, but Ogami had asked her to keep him a secret from them just a little longer. That was probably because if she'd told her parents his name, he would have drawn suspicion from someone. Or if she were living with her mother and father, they would have found out about him. Akari wondered if her mother and father went to her room in their search for her. There were lots of things in her room that would show a connection to Ogami, but that evidence was probably already gone. She'd given him a spare key to her room. In fact, he could have done something like put a pamphlet for a long trip on her desk. Her mother and father could have seen that and assumed she went on some trip far away, even though she was right there in the very same town as them. The next day, she first checked that Ogami was not on the roof, and then, using the umbrella and piece of tent as a makeshift shelter, she wrote a letter.
While he hasn't gotten the location of the money out of me, I don't think he'll kill me. He said that if I call for help, he'll harm my mother and father. Please contact the police without letting him find out about it. She wrote as many details as she could about her current status, the place she was confined to, and the man called Ogami Teruhiko. The notepad he'd thrown down to her was only the size of her palm, so she used several of the sheets. If she could make contact with the outside world without Ogami finding out, she should be able to find rescue. The problem is how she'd get that letter to the outside. One way was to ball up the letters and stick her arm out through a gap in the pipes and throw them to try to get them through. If she was lucky, they'd reach the outside and someone passing by would pick them up. But she tested the theory out with lots of balled up papers, and not only were there far too many pipes, air conditioner outdoor units and other obstacles in the way, the distance was also much too far. She tried turning them into paper airplanes to make them fly through, but to no avail. They always knocked into something part way through, lost speed and hit the ground. She gave up on finding any way to throw the letters to get them through to the other side. She thought of putting the letters in an empty water bottle and dropping it down the storm drain she'd been using as a toilet. Maybe it would eventually make its way to the ocean and someone would read it. But the diameter of the glass bottle was clearly too big to fit in the gaps in the grating, and she couldn't fold or flatten the glass bottle to make it thin enough to get through. Without some kind of ability to make things softer, a bottle with letters in it was not going to float all the way to the ocean. Was there no way to get the letters to the outside? No, there was one way left. Akari held the letters tight and went to sleep.
She had no idea when that chance would come. Also, she made sure to always leave a little bit of food left over. She saved away just a small piece of the sausage that had been thrown down to her. She'd hoped that, when that light brown cat came back, she might be able to gain its affection if she had some food to share. That cat that had made its way through the narrow gaps in the buildings to where she was had been wearing a collar, meaning someone was taking care of it. If she was able to fasten her letters to the collar, the cat should deliver the letters to its owner. Akari was resolute. She was not going to beg that man for her life. She was going to get out of here to her freedom. Someday she would feel the morning sun on her whole body and fill her lungs with the wind of Morioh. Once he caught the flu. The memories of when it happened were in text and stored in his leather-bound book, but he'd never look at those pages again. That's because those memories were stored in a forbidden section. He personally set up several forbidden sections within which he stored his negative memories. If he accidentally read from one of those sections, memories of painful experiences would flood into his head. So while he didn't purposely go to reread the memories about when he almost died from the flu, he would have a vague recollection of it being an unpleasant time even if he didn't open the book. To Takuma, there is a clear difference between a memory and a recollection. The difference was the storage location. Memories were stored as printed characters in the book. Information he perceived would be retrieved perfectly unaltered by any emotions. It was like a notebook outside of his body that linked to his own brain and listed information on each individual human experience that made him up. Recollections were more like the impressions left in his heart, rather than actual information. A melding of a watercolour-like sketches and emotion. The storage location for that was in his chest. Memories and recollections affect each other. That's because the emotions and recollections in his heart are also recorded in the leather-bound book. On the other hand, rereading parts of the book would bring about new emotions and recollections. This loop would keep repeating as long as he lived. He put his arms through the sleeves of his uniform, and as he left the house his body was unsteady. But compared to the recollection of the flu he had when he was 12, he decided this cold was nothing to complain about. Ever since he'd caught a cold on Friday, his body had been sluggish. Takuma bought an envelope at the Sun Mart and then started coughing as he walked. Around where the shopping district ended was Morioh's municipal library. It had a front gate made of black bars that gave off a solemnity reminiscent of an ancient foreign castle. He received a phone call from Chiho in the afternoon.
Has that cold still not gone away? Have you gone to the hospital? I'm sure they would have just a spot for you there, Senpai. Why don't you go? They should be able to cure your cold, I think. Well, not that I'm a doctor or anything.
They decided to meet at 4 p.m. that afternoon, and she hung up. The Thorn building had Western-style pointed roofs, on which were 7 spires, along with one octagonal dome. He sat down in the back of the first floor past the entrance lobby with black floorboards and the recognisable faces of the staff. There was still quite a while until 4 o'clock, so he thought he'd get some schoolwork done until Chiho arrived. He took out the envelope he purchased earlier and wrote to Higashitata Josuke-sama on it. He'd gained the ability to imitate other people's handwriting, so it'd be difficult for anyone to tell he was the one who'd written it. 4 days had passed since he'd encountered Josuke at the roundabout, and he hadn't been stopped by him or his comrades since. They'd looked perplexed, which was a sensible reaction, as they were looking for a student that had red scars in their arms, and they'd found over 30 like that. They probably had no idea how things had gotten like this. But he couldn't relax. Josuke was drastically different from the other delinquents. That was the face of knowing what he should use his ability for. He called out his book and tore out a page. It was a forbidden section page. While making sure he hadn't had the wrong cover or accidentally read the page, he placed it in the envelope addressed to Josuke. After he sealed it, he had to put it in his pocket and take it with him. That's because if the envelope went further than 30 meters from his body, the page would disappear. He didn't know why exactly, it was just one of the qualities of the book. He'd done experiments on this before. He'd leave the book on desks or on the floor, go into the next room and then come back. Generally speaking, the book would just be in the same state as he'd left it in. However, when Takuma's body was over 30 meters from it, the book would have disappeared when he returned to the room. However, the book wouldn't be totally gone from the world. If he focused, it would appear in the palm of his hand again. It seemed the book could only exist within a sphere with a 30-meter radius extending out from Takuma's body. Still, that was plenty enough distance for him.
He just had to put the envelope in Josuke's house, then wait right next to it until he opened the envelope. He couldn't do something like what he'd done with Arikasa Hanai when she bled out and died, because Josuke's family would likely call the police. Therefore, he'd have to finish the task with his own hand. It was quiet outside the library, so when Takuma coughed it echoed across the ceiling and the bookcases. Futaba Chiho arrived long before the arranged time. Chiho was wearing a scarf and gloves. It wasn't actually snowing, but it was cloudy as usual. After passing the shopping district and train stations, she saw the line of headstones in the graveyard. Next to the graveyard was an Italian restaurant which had an exterior that looked like it was remodelled like a foreign house. It seemed to be the place she wanted to show him around. She stopped in front of the shop.
I heard that if you eat here, all the parts of your body in bad health will improve. I'm sure it'll cure your cold too, senpai.
The entrance had Trattoria/Trasadi written on it. He searched the leather-bound book for those words and the sounds they made. There were 0 hits of visual information, and there was 1 hit of audio information. He had once heard the name of that shop with his ears. On an autumn day last year, he'd heard a girl say the shop name Trasadi. At the time, he didn't take any notice of it because of the background noise, but now he tried to focus on their conversation again. The characters printed in the book had compressed time from the past. The image of that noisy classroom surfaced in his head. What he overheard in the girl's conversation was hard to believe. Apparently, someone with inoperable cancer had had a meal there, and the next day, their x-rays showed that all traces of a tumour had disappeared.
Okay, that sounds interesting. And I get the feeling that unless I rest someplace, this cold's gonna get so bad I'll keel over.
They looked at the info board next to the entrance. It said, "Today's cooking. Depends on the customer. Starting at 3,500 yen. As they entered the shop, the only tables they saw were 2 round ones. It had a nice interior design with a good atmosphere, but there wasn't a single customer. He and Chiho looked at each other and then sat down at one of the tables. An Italian chef came and greeted them. He stared fixedly at Takuma and Chiho's hands, looked deeply into their eyes, then checked the colours of their lips and how chapped they were and nodded. "Understood." He uttered that one word, poured water into their cups and returned to the kitchen. They weren't sure what it was he understood, but apparently the way this restaurant worked was he just decided the course on his own without showing the customers any menus. The shop had the heat on, but Takuma's cold had gotten a bit worse from walking around outside. He had a chill and had started to get dizzy. It was at the point where he was considering staying in there even if he didn't like the cooking. He sipped the water in his cup and was amazed at how good it tasted. According to the stories Chiho had heard, it was special water that would clear away any dirt from the eyes. Supposedly, anyone who's low on sleep that drinks it would have all waste products in their eyes expelled through tears. So it looked like this shop used healthy ingredients with the goal of improving its customers' physicality.
I hope he doesn't bring out any dishes that are low in salt content. That'd be really unsatisfying.
Every part of Chiho's body was thin enough to fit through a donut hole, but she tended to eat more than average. In the end, it seemed her worries were baseless. The courses flowed out of the kitchen one after another, and every one of them was delicious. The appetizers, the pastas, the main dishes, they were each personalized to suit Takuma and Chiho. And with every bite Chiho took, she said,
"This is so good."
There were times when they took their first slurp of soup and suddenly felt upset, then dissolved into a panic and started muttering things like they'd lost their minds.
Man, I wish this stuff came out of faucets.
As they ate the food, a strange phenomenon occurred. It happened when Takuma was eating the starter salad. When he bit into the herbs sprinkled on it, a strong scent burst out of it. The scent permeated from deep into his throat to his nasal cavity, stimulating his mucous membranes. Takuma let out an enormous sneeze, expelling a huge amount of snot. It was like all the contents of his head had just come out. And with that, the stuffed nose that had been bothering him for days disappeared. His breathing relaxed, and he was able to inhale a full breath of fresh air in through his nose. After Chiho ate her pasta, she suddenly let out a strange cough. This odd-textured pasta seemed to have stuck to the back of her throat. As she coughed painfully and violently, she seemed to be straining herself quite a bit as the area around the base of her neck turned red. Before long, she swallowed the pasta, and when her coughing died down, she touched her shoulder with a puzzled expression on her face. When she pressed on her shoulder with her finger, it went limp and creepily sank in.
The stiffness in my shoulders went away. They were so stiff before, but after all that coughing, I think my muscles might have relaxed.
Takuma's main dish was a stewed beef dish. When he put the meat in his mouth and bit into it, the savoury taste melted into the sauce and spread over the surface of his tongue. That flavour was converted into an electrical signal, sparked across his nerve endings and shook his brain. When the last bit of it settled in his stomach, there was a sudden change. Perhaps as a result of a chemical reaction to the meat and sauce, the inside of his stomach became tinged with heat. Then it turned into a ferocious heat, like a ball of magma had been placed in his stomach. If he didn't vomit it out, he would die. Just as that thought crossed his mind, he felt the heat being absorbed by his stomach, then going down his blood vessels and spreading through his body. A peaceful feeling of arms enveloping his body spread around it, as all his chills went away and all his cold symptoms disappeared. The only dish left was dessert. While they waited for the plates to be brought to them, Takuma talked to Chiho. Her cheeks were dyed pink, and she looked so happy that steam was coming out of the top of her head.
I want to go back in time just so we can redo everything from the moment we came into this shop,
she said, mournfully.
Well, you could just think back when you were eating, can't you?
Yeah, but thinking back to it won't make my belly bulge.
Is that normal?
What, does it work differently for you, senpai?
Whenever he placed food in his mouth, the taste information of the cooking would be preserved in the leather-bound book. Then you could just go reread the record the same way you'd reheat leftover food in a microwave. The taste would spread across his tongue like he'd just eaten a bite of the exact same food.
It's probably just a hallucination caused by nerve stimuli, but I feel full just by tracing back my memory.
Like taking a trip into the past? That sounds nice. I'd like to hallucinate so I can taste that again,
Chiho said, seeming envious. She would have needed to physically manifest a book to do that, but apparently she didn't mind just imagining the feeling of being full. When he read through the descriptions in his leather-bound book, he really did get a sensation like his mind, and just his mind, was going back in time. A string of symbols in a row would suddenly arrest his consciousness and carry it to the mind of his past self experiencing something in the past. When that happened, he experienced his past consciousness, and additionally, he'd experience another consciousness, looking on the events with a bird's eye view. It was like a form of time travel where he left his body behind.
Time travel? Sounds like something out of a dream.
There might be somebody out there with a superpower like that.
He couldn't say for certain there wasn't someone out there with the ability to go to the past or future.
If somebody with that kind of ability went into the past, it might be possible for them to meet their past self. They might even happen to save their childhood self that had nearly lost their life on a snowy night.
For dessert, the two of them had a tiramisu. One spoonful of it gave them a mellow, velvety feeling on their tongues. When they were done, they realised their skin had become moist and smooth. When they left the restaurant, it had gotten dark. Chiho had been worrying if all her novel writing had been the cause of her stiff shoulders, but now her shoulders were loose, she was walking with a spring in her step. Dishes at that restaurant really did seem to improve their physical condition. The two of them thought about what kind of trick there might have been, but they couldn't figure anything out.
I got a letter from my mum. She's doing well, apparently,
said Chiho as they walked around the deserted housing district.
What's a new spouse do for a living?
He's a farm manager.
That's a surprising choice.
He'd heard from her about her parents' divorce. It sounded like there was a slew of reasons her mother would want a new household. The outdoor lamps dotted all over the street lit up green lawns, a blue doghouse and a red bicycle. Futaba Chiho went quiet, so he simply walked next to her in silence. He only ever spent a moderate amount of time hanging out with the people in his class and maintained a balance of putting a distance between himself and anyone he started to get close to. But Chiho was special. His relationship with her was always in a suspended state. It was a problem much more complicated and obtruse than killing Josuke, Koichi and the others. As they walked silently down the street, they turned the corner and almost bumped into a man they didn't recognise. The man was using his cell phone, so he took a moment longer to notice and wasn't able to move out of the way in time, bumping shoulders with them. The man made a small sound and his cell phone fell to the ground.
Sorry,
said Takuma, trying to apologise and move on. But then he heard a call from behind him.
Hold it right there, damn it!
Turning back, he saw the man pick up his phone and glare at him as he started operating it.
Sorry, my arse! Look, no matter what I do, this thing won't respond. You just busted it.
Under the light of the outdoor lamps, Takuma got a better look at the man. He had facial features not unlike that of a troglodyte. He had a brawny physique and wore boorish clothing. Adorned on his fat finger was a creepy-looking angel ornament. Next to Chiho, Takuma lowered his head.
I'm honestly really sorry. I'll reflect on my actions. As for your cell phone, let me think. If you have a warranty, you should be able to go get it repaired.
Fuck off! What's with that face? You're glaring right at me. You think I'm stupid or something?
Yelled the man in a frenzy. It seemed Takuma had glared at the man without realising it. He'd been bullied by delinquents like these since he was little.
No, I honestly do feel bad about it. Please forgive me.
This time he tried apologising with a bit more of an asking for forgiveness kind of look on his face. But it didn't seem to quell the man's mood. He suddenly went to punch Takuma's left cheek. Takuma could have dodged it, but he decided it would be better to let himself get hit. Behind him, Chiho let out a short yelp. Pain coursed through his cheek. It seemed the man's ring had torn through Takuma's skin. When he put his hand to his cheek, he felt something wet. In the light of the outdoor lamps, the blood on his fingers shone red.
Does that hurt, you shitty little brat? You think a warranty's gonna fix that gash on your cheek? See what I'm saying? A warranty's not some perfect thing that'll just fix everything. Only way I'm letting you off the hook is if you pay me the money for a new phone. Got it?
Chiho came close to him with a worried look on her face, so he thought he'd try to calm her down.
Hey, what's that face? Are you worried? Wait over there. I've got something to say to this troglodyte.
As he tried to move away from her, the man cut in like he was replying to what Takuma said.
The fuck did you just say?
Hey, hold on. At least looks like you can understand human speech, so you should know that interrupting people is bad manners. Calm down and let me talk to her. As soon as I'm done, I'll promise I'll listen to what you have to say. Oh, what, are you in a hurry? Gotta hop on a boat home to the jungle right after this?
When he said that, the blood vessels in the man's temple bulged out, making his face look like a tectonic deformation.
Oh dear, it seems I've made you mad. I honestly hadn't the slightest intention of doing so.
He thought of the book in his mind. The book appeared from his palm and he felt its weight gently plop onto his hand. As a child, he believed it to have appeared so he could organise his out-of-control memories. But wasn't it actually the other way around? Wasn't it because he had this ability lying dormant in him that he was able to remember everything to begin with? The man went to punch Takuma, seemingly aiming for the right cheek this time.
What a slow punch,
thought Takuma as he watched the fist careen towards him. His book would be faster. He flipped through the pages and found the passage he was looking for with plenty of time to spare. The book had rules. You always had to flip through the pages from the present to the past, so descriptions of events that had only just happened could be opened to in an instant. Just before the man's fist had reached Takuma's right cheek, a loud bang rang out from around the residential district, and the man's left cheek split open right before his eyes. A gash in his skin opened with a sound, and a splash of blood scattered through the air. The man put his hand on his left cheek and made an expression like he had no idea what had just happened.
If it weren't for that angel ring you're wearing, it wouldn't have broken the skin and make it a wound like that. You'll get a better idea once you go home and look in the mirror, but it's the exact same gash you made on my face. That pain from being punched is what you made me feel. You just relived my experience.
The man made a creeped-out face and backed away from Takuma.
What's wrong? Are you weirded out by the fact you've hurt plenty of people the same way before? But this guy here doesn't seem afraid. Hey, don't back away. I remember that birthmark on your face. It was on a poster at the police box. You look just like one of the police sketches on a wanted poster there. Were you perhaps involved in a robbery 5 years ago?
He searched the book for the man's face. When he checked to see if the man's face had ever entered his vision, he found a very similar face was drawn on a police poster. The date and location of the event was on the poster along with the police sketch, so when he read it aloud to the man's face, he went pale.
The wanted poster with your face on it got taken down a while ago, huh? So that's why you're able to loiter around here worry-free? You gonna report me? No. Get away from me already. I ain't believing that. You're planning on calling the police, aren't you?
The man took a knife out of his pocket. It was a small pocket-sized blade.
Give me a break,
thought Takuma. Chiho put her back against the fence of one of the properties and made a face like she was trying to hide how scared she was. She didn't cry or scream, but she stared at Takuma with teary eyes. Her light brown irises looked pretty illuminated in the outdoor lights.
It'll be all over for me if you call. Please, don't tell anybody about me.
The man readied his knife. The silver point trembled slightly. The man made an expression showing he was clearly not in his right mind. The kind that made you think that no matter what words you said to him, you'd only get the thrust of a blade as a reply. Takuma had already resigned himself, not to the man in front of his eyes, but to something drastic he couldn't resist doing. The man thrust his knife forward. At that moment, Takuma kicked the man's hand upwards. The knife flew high in the air, drawing a silver trail of its trajectory. Takuma caught it between its middle and pointer fingers, right where it fell. He spun the knife around and grabbed the hilt the same way he would when he would spin pens with his fingers during tests. The man probably couldn't even tell what had just happened. With a few quick swishes, Takuma stroked the knife along the man's face like he would spread cream on a sponge cake.
I'm giving this back. After I do, please remember what just happened as you pick it up and leave. If you go to a hospital now, I might be able to reattach them.
He handed the knife over to the man. At that point, the man was still standing stock still, staring at Takuma's face. Not until after Takuma pulled Chiho's hand and started walking away did several things finally detach from his face and hit the ground. The man fell to his knees, pressed his hands into his face and let out a moan. A large volume of looming blood leaked from between the gaps in his fingers. They moved around 300 metres and entered the park managed by the town. The park lay right at the border between the residential district and the commercial district. In the afternoons it was busy with elderly people out on walks and kids playing, but once it grew dark it became totally deserted. The pond was spotted with lights, and occasionally the sound of a fish splashing would echo through the air. Chiho stopped atop a small bridge. A strong pond smell hung over the area. Breathing heavily, she sat down in that spot. Her legs were shaking, and the strength seemed to have left them. When Takuma came over and put his hand on her shoulder, she clung to his leg and spoke through sobs.
Man with the knife said it. If you beg for your life, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. One that saved me back then really was you, senpai.
She was crying. Trying to fool her wouldn't work anymore. He'd used the knife in front of this girl, just as he had that day in 1995. He thought she'd find out one day, but he didn't think today would be that day. Takuma crouched next to her and wiped away a tear on her cheek with the tip of his index finger.
Someday soon, there'll probably come a time when you'll wish you'd never gotten involved with me.
She looked up to ask a question. Takuma's face was reflected in her red-tinged eyes. There was no doubt she'd gotten that light brown colour from her mother.
Eventually you'll understand. You'll regret everything back to the moment you were born.
He heard the sound of a fish splashing. He saw a ripple spread across the dark water's surface and disappear. He was alive just to push one man into despair. The man's name was Ugami Teruhiko. He'd gotten married 17 years earlier and changed his last name. He now had one daughter, and now she was in his arms. Later on, Josuke-kun explained it to me, and I learned the details for the first time. The house Josuke-kun and his family lived in was a standalone Western-style house found in a quiet housing district.
He lived alone with his mother there, and I'd visited the house many times. Every time, Josuke-kun's mom asked me,
"How's your relationship with Yukiko-san going?"
Josuke-kun's mom was really young, definitely not someone you'd expect to have a son in his first year of high school. That evening, Josuke-kun's mom put a tea kettle on her gas stove to boil some water. As the blue flames started to heat the kettle up, a clang, clang, clang sound started to echo. The front doorbell rang, and Josuke-kun's mom went to answer it. When she opened the door, there was no sign of anyone outside.
"Maybe the bell was broken,"
she thought. Just as she was about to go back out inside to stop shivering from the cold, she realized there was an envelope at her feet. "To Higashikata Josuke-sama," read the addressee line.
"Envelope for you,"
Josuke-kun's mom said, holding the envelope. But Josuke-kun couldn't pry his hands off of what he was doing. He was about to set a best time on a racing game he bought a few days ago. A letter? From who? The letter didn't even have a stamp or postmark on it. Apparently it had been delivered directly to the door.
"It might be an ad or something, like somebody selling school uniforms."
"Check what's in it for me."
"You're okay if I open it then?"
"Yeah." Using the game controller, Josuke-kun made the car in on the display do a drift. As the scenery flew by at high speed, the car turned the corner, making sparks fly out. Josuke-kun heard the sound of an envelope being opened behind him.
"Doesn't look like there's anything in it at all."
The car Josuke-kun was controlling collided with another, making his rear wheels slip. The kettle let out a whistling sound. The water had come to a boil, and steam had begun to forcefully flow out of it. "Oh, looks like the water's boiling," Josuke said to his mother, who should have been standing right behind him. But she didn't reply, and he didn't hear the sound of her walking over to turn the flame off. The kettle just let out a higher pitch, like it was going crazy. All that seemed odd to Josuke-kun, so he turned around. There was a puddle of blood spreading out on the floor. On the display, the car lost control, hit a wall, and got wrecked. Josuke-kun's mom was lying on the ground and had lost consciousness due to severe blood loss. Blood was spewing like a fountain out of gashes that had opened on both her arms. He said they were like wounds that had been inflicted by a scissor or something in order to commit suicide. She had a dream. It was a memory of when she'd taken a trip overseas with him. "I found a nice little antique shop down the alleyway," Teruhiko said. He said it was a small shop run by an elderly man, and it didn't seem to have a single souvenir that looked like it had been made in a factory to sell to tourists. "I found a beautiful necklace on one of the shelves further in. Just when I picked it up to buy it for you, I carelessly bumped into the shelf behind me." He explained how the merchandise that had been stocked on the shelves had fallen on top of him, giving him a cut on his shoulder. Types of ironware fell all over the floor. Among them all, there was one with a sharp point with a slight amount of blood on it. It was something like an arrowhead, but the crack that had formed in it had warped it quite a bit. The shopkeeper said it was probably just some failed creative work someone had thrown out. The pain from the cut on his shoulder got worse as time went on. Once he got back to the hotel, he was so nauseous he couldn't even walk. Maybe the cut had gotten infected. His shoulder had swollen to the point it looked like he had a ripe red tomato stuck to him, and on top of that he developed a fever. "I can't believe how careless I was. I've ruined our vacation," he said, lying down on the bed. Outside the windows, they could see the Western European town dyed in red by the sunset.
"Don't worry. I'm sure you'll feel better by tomorrow."
Akari grasped Ugami Teruhiko's hand. He put his other hand under his pillow and pulled out a necklace. He'd apparently bought it at the antique shop, and at the end of a silver chain was a round jewel that looked like a scarab. The jewel was the shiny black stone which, according to him, was made from a fossilized tree. It was lightweight, could be electrically charged through friction, and apparently long ago people had believed it contained magic. Really, she couldn't blame them. Its beautiful black colour looked like the night compressed into a stone. That cut on Ugami Teruhiko's shoulder would become a bruise that would stay there forever. It was a bruise shaped like a horse. It was like the germs that had been on the arrowhead had entered his body and seemingly took up residence there in his shoulder. When she woke up, he oriented herself with her surroundings. Under a small ceiling she'd made from an umbrella frame and a piece of cloth, she was lying on the ground with her body curled up into a ball. It was already past daybreak, but the gap between the buildings was dreary. As she got up, bits of dirt dropped from between her hair. She didn't have a mirror, so she couldn't make sure, but her face was probably starting to look awful, with bits of dried mud stuck to it. She made a mark on the wall and looked around her. The ground between the buildings was warm, soft and muddy. There was no sign of any cat paw prints. It looks like one hadn't come around when she was sleeping either. Time ticked on without any changes. She felt like her own life was being whittled away a little at a time. To try to draw out a cat, she always left a small amount of food out. One day she suddenly noticed a rat chowing down on it. It was a creepy rat covered in filth that would make anyone back away if they were glared at by it. She'd been creeped out by these animals since she was little, to the point where she'd always change the channel whenever she'd see one on TV. Scared and unable to shoo it away, all she could do now was stand there and watch as it put the food in its mouth and ran away into the storm drain. Maybe the rat had worked out it'd be able to find food between the two buildings. It visited at a rate of once every 3 days. She figured out it was coming out through the storm drain, so she took scraps of cardboard, used them to cover the lattice and weighed them down with mud. But the rat opened a hole in the cardboard and dug up the dirt. While she was sleeping, she felt something tickle her feet and the nape of her neck, making her bolt upright, only to find the rat's filthy tail had been touching her skin. Every night Ugami came to the roof. He talked to her, but Akari would completely ignore him. She wanted some tool she could use to kill the rat, but she had no intentions of asking him for anything. While she was sleeping, he dropped an armful-sized box down, making a huge noise that made her bolt upright. She thought it might be another trap, so she waited until dawn before carefully checking the contents of the box. There was a towel blanket, a mirror, soap, a vinyl sheet, and biscuits that were some years past their best if eaten by date on it. Also, Ugami had connected the holes to a water supply on the roof, so she'd always have water flowing down the wall. It was just a trickle, but now she could wet her throat and rinse her body as much as she wanted, without having to worry about running out of water. This wasn't Ugami being kind. He dropped these supplies down because he didn't have any other choice. He had to keep Akari alive. He couldn't let her get sick or lose her sanity either. In order to keep her in a state where she could write the location of the money, there was a need to manage her mental and physical health. But at the same time, he probably expected it to be a war of attrition. She'd already drawn over 15 lines on the wall. Everything was precious. She never even threw empty bottles away, just in case she could use them for something later. She even made special care to preserve the cardboard box the supplies had come in. She looked at her face in the mirror and tears started to well up in her eyes. She rinsed her face with the water trickling down the wall. She was a human, she told herself. But when she tried to use human speech, the horrible burning on her tongue and throat made it so she could only make an ugh sound. However, she was definitely a conscious, thinking human being. She had a human mother and father, and she had a name. She decided that starting now, she'd look at herself hundreds of times in the mirror every day and look at her face. She started with arranging her hair. The hair she saw in the mirror was dried out and dirty. Using the vinyl sheet from the supply box, she made a roof to cover her from the rain. This wouldn't be like before, when all she could do was cover her face when she was sleeping. This was a ceiling big enough to cover her entire body. It was pretty flimsy, but wind didn't blow between the buildings, so it wouldn't get blown apart. The water trickling down the wall excessively dampened the ground. To prevent that, she dug a ditch to guide the water into the storm drain. She crushed an empty can to use as a scoop. It lowered the amount of moisture, making it somewhat pleasant. She didn't see anything she could use to trap the rat, so she ended up spending her days unable to deal with it, and that filth-covered rat looked disgusting every time she saw it. But no matter how long she waited, the cat never came, which made her uneasy. What if it just happened to get lost here that one day and would never come back again? Or what if he'd been killed by getting hit by a car or died of a disease? What if its owner moved away, taking the cat with them? All kinds of possibilities ran through her head. She'd been able to maintain her sanity by clinging to the hope of using the cat to deliver her letter. She spent every day just surviving and thinking about that. In lieu of a magazine or newspaper, Ugami dropped down a crossword puzzle book and a book called Family Medical Dictionary. Apparently, he was saying that if she had nothing to do and felt like she was going to die,
She should solve crossword puzzles, and if she was feeling sick, she'd better figure it out herself. She had no newspapers, so she had no idea what was going on in the world. Once in a while, she'd hear classical music coming from outside. Before she'd been pushed between the two buildings, she heard rumours at her workplace of an open terrace cafe being constructed nearby. The music must have been carrying from there. Was that Mozart? She could just barely make it out with how muffled it was. One morning, when she woke up, there was a postcard lying next to her. It was unused and new, without any stains or dirt on it. It had a picture of a field that stretched all the way to the horizon printed on it. On the grass were two horses pressing against each other. She had no idea if they were parent and child, lovers, siblings, or what. The wind must have blown it between the buildings. She wrapped it in vinyl and kept it safe so it wouldn't get wet. When she listened to the music from outside and stared at the postcard, she felt like she could climb right into the field printed on it. She felt like the card in her hands had turned into a window and a picture of her field was swaying in the wind. When she closed her eyes, she saw herself standing barefoot in the field. There, the refreshing scent of grass wafted through the air, and the sharp tips of the grass tickled the bottoms of her feet. When the wind blew, it made a wave in the grass draw towards her and then travel off far away. The horses on the grass were bigger than she, and really quite overwhelming when she got close to them. They had lustrous black pelts, and when she placed her palm on them, she could feel the gentle movements of their breathing. Until the two horses snorted and ran away, Akari was able to stay in her dream world. When she opened her eyes, she once again realized the fact that she was stuck in the chasm between the buildings, but she was still able to focus on the fact that she was alive. The number of lines on the wall that she drew once each morning grew larger and larger. Even after the number reached over 50, the cat didn't come back. Then, one early afternoon when she was listening to music, she realized she'd never used any of the menstrual sanitary products in the items that Teruhiku had thrown down to her. She recounted all the lines she'd drawn on the wall.
By the light switch, who watches over you? Make a little birdhouse in your soul, not to put too fine a point on it. Say I'm the only bee in your bonnet. Make a little birdhouse in your soul. I have a secret to tell from my electrical well. It's a simple message and I'm leaving out the whistles and bells, so the room must listen to me. Filibuster vigilantly. My name is Blue Canary, one note spelled L-I-T-E. My story's infinite, like the Longines Symphony. It doesn't rest. Blue Canary in the alley by the light switch, who watches over you? Make a little birdhouse in your soul, not to put too fine a point on it.